Chapter 1 of The Revolt of the Birds by Melville Davison Post. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Revolt of the Birds by Melville Davison Post. Chapter 1. It was the last outpost of down-going men, a sort of seamen's club in the abominable environs of Hong Kong. The Wu Fang Company maintained it for the white officers employed in its service. Everybody knows the reputation of the Wu Fang Company. It is the most notorious of all the Oriental companies trading in the China Sea. Gun-running, opium, even piracy are charged against it when its ships are out of the beaten track. It was a room under a warehouse, looking out on a sort of canal in which the waters seemed to lie stagnant and unmoving. There were tables in it, and a dirty matting on the floor. Against the wall were a few shelves made from packing cases. In them were some stained dog-eared works on navigation. There was dirty canvas on the wall. There was the stench of alcohol in it, and tobacco. A single window fouled with cobweb, looking out on the canal, alone lighted it. One marked a smoky lamp against the wall, a cheap kerosene lamp that the Germans used to put out in the East. It was afternoon and hot. A few men were in the room. They were strange human derelicts on the way down, but maintaining a sort of air, a sort of manner, as though it were a memory from the honorable life from which they had descended. A queer group gathered from all portions of the earth. They were all at the very end of life. I mean at the end of any form of life that one could speak of. This club of the Wu Fang Company was the last stand of their fleet in the world. One stepped off from it into the abyss of the Far East. A little wizened Chinaman, gliding about in slippered feet, carried in the drink and the tobacco that the Wu Fang Company provided. The drink was a poisonous brandy. I had drifted in here on my mission. Someone had told me to see Bennett of the Wu Fang Company. He would have the last knowledge of men disappearing into the mystery of the East, the last glimpse of them as they descended through its fluid floor. He now sat beyond me at a table by the window. He was a big man with pale blue eyes, a heavy, pasty face pitted with smallpox, a strange human creature. It was impossible to tell the nationality of the man. I think he was an American, and I think he must have been bred and trained for the sea. He might have been in the naval service of the States in his far-off youth. I knew what was commonly known about the man before I went to find him. He had been in every form of service and on every sea. He knew all about the world of waters, and he had gone steadily down. One heard little about the causes of this descent. There was always a break in the narrative when one gets the history of the derelict of the East, a sort of hiatus where the speaker pauses, gets another cigarette out of the box on the table, or makes some vague gesture. One is supposed to understand that at this point in the man's life, something happened, and he took yet another step downward. Thus in the end they come into the service of the Wu Fang Company, and, from it, the abyss engulfs them. There were 3 other men in the room besides Bennett. I tried to place them in their nationality. One was a German, a northern German. He was not past 40, a big blonde. Bennett called him the Baron Nordheim. Another I thought was an Italian, a little dark man, thin and very carefully dressed. And there was an Englishman with the strong, clean-cut features of some of the best families of his race. Tall, stooped. He sat in his chair as though all energy in him had been removed. The man drew my attention for the one fact that the conspicuous element in him was an utter weakness. There was no firm fiber left. There was no resistance to evil in that face or figure. He maintained the manner, the speech, and the customs of his race, but it was easy to see that he was seized upon and dominated by any temptation that approached him. I hardly understood how he could be of any service even to the Wu Fang Company, but, as I have said, its activities were varied. They all wore a sort of uniform. Bennett had the uniform of an English skipper, threadbare and stained, picked up doubtless at some seaman's sail by the Wu Fang Company. There was good cloth and gold braid on these other ship captains' uniforms, but it was cloth long wetted with sea-water and dried in the sun, and it was tarnished gold braid. The Englishman had an ancient copy of the Times. He was nearsighted, and he held it close to his face. It was torn. The Chinese servant had probably fished it out of a rubbish heap somewhere in the European quarter. The Wufang Company did not keep up the periodicals of the world for its sea captains. It provided, as I've said, only the essentials: uniforms of the service, drink, tobacco, and what was more important than any, I imagine, opium. The Italian had been reading a thumb-worn little book. When I came in, he put it down on the floor beside the chair, his big finger marking a page in it. He sat perfectly still, his other hand on his knee, his eyes fixed on the floor beyond him. He paid no attention to either Bennett or myself. He did not seem to see us, to see anything. I'm trying to make you realize this place and the men I found in it. It did not seem to belong in the world. The men in the place seemed to belong in some form of nightmare, some vague conception of a hell where men maintained the forms and manners of the world from which they had descended. But it was all a sort of abominable pretense. They spoke with exaggerated courtesy. They were careful to accord each his title and distinction. They listened attentively when one spoke, and they made some remark at the end of it, or some courteous interjection. But one felt, as I have said, that it was all a ghastly pretense. I had directed the conversation. I had an object in it. It began when I entered precisely after the manner of conversation in any officers' club in the East. I had a letter of introduction to Bennett. It had been given to me with a significant smile. If I wish to get anything out of these men, I must respect their fictions. I must maintain the formalities customary among officers of the class to which they pretended. One can understand why these derelicts were sticklers for form. It was the only thing they had. It maintained the pretension in which they alone existed. I had gotten the conversation directed toward strange happenings on the sea, toward mysterious incidents which had happened in their lives. I thought these incidents might give me some information on the thing I was after. But before the conversation reached the point, I was impressed with how nearly it resembled the conversation in the real officers' club in Hong Kong. And, what was other resemblance to the real club, these men were authorities on some form of life in which they were engaged. But it was not this counterfeit conversation of the real club that I was after. I moved it into another direction. I moved it into the direction of the experiences I spoke of. Bennett helped me. I do not know that he realized precisely what I was seeking, but here was a field in which he could be very proud of his associates, in which they would excel. Surely of all persons in the world, they had had the largest experience of extraordinary events. They gave me these events as one recites the incidents of an historical narrative. It is not my intention here to elaborate what they said. Their strange tales have little to do directly with this story, except, as it happened, they each illustrated a vital point in it. I listened, made the reply courteous, and thanked them for their consideration of me. I bought them tobacco and brandy, and bid them adieu when they went out, for they presently drifted out, leaving Bennett and myself alone by the table near the cobwebbed window that looked out on the sluggish canal. I was not impressed with the stories of the strange events that these men related. I said that much to Bennett. I said they impressed me as fiction. He was silent for some time. He moved his big hand over his face. Finally he replied. "They might be true," he said. "Incredible things happen." He directed my attention to the little worn book lying by the chair in which the Italian had been seated. "There is nothing too incredible to be attached to these men," he said. "You wouldn't believe the things in which these men are interested. Let me get you that book." He got up heavily, crossed the room, picked up the book, and put it down open before me. It was a translation in Italian of The Passing of Arthur, with quaint pictures of the three queens who came, in the legend, in a mystic barge to take Arthur to Avalon. I looked at the book with some astonishment. What interest could a down-going man have in a thing like this? Bennett was leaning over the table. He looked at me strangely. "Do you think a thing like that could happen?" he said. I told him that it never did happen in this world, that it was a fairy story, this tale of Arthur with the queens and Avalon. The ship captain said he was not so certain of it. He had known things just as incredible to happen. A fairy story couldn't beat it. It was no use to say a thing could not happen because it sounded like a fairy story. Take, for example, the things these men told here. They might be true, and they might be lies. Men in the Far East got infected with the Arabian Nights virus. But strange things, incredible things, did happen in the China Sea. Bennett sat over the tumbler of vile brandy, his arms heavily on the table. I didn't drink the stuff. I kept pouring it out on the dirty matting. It was a trick I had become deft in. One acquires skill when one must save oneself from poison. There was a new English label on the bottle. Too new. That label was printed somewhere in a cellar. And the liquid, only the devil knew what it was. Alcohol of some sort as a base with any cheap filler that would bite. Cheap was the idea. The Wu Fang Company was after the kick for the money. He spoke suddenly without moving. He prepared his words with an interjection, a sort of vocal comment, the sound one utters alone when one finally arrives at a conclusion or comes to the end of considering something incredible. "That story Chillingsworth told just now?" He made a correction. "Captain Chillingsworth." He spoke the words precisely. The talk, as I have said, had been on the mysteries of the sea, strange things that happen in out-of-the-way places of the world of water, indeterminate things that lie in the twilight country between dreams and the hard reality of life. This story that Bennett was thinking of was the story the English skipper related. The mystery of dreams had come into the talk. Dreams! The Englishman had repeated the word as one pronounces a formula which he wishes profoundly to consider. He was devitalized with opium, and the mere uttering of sound seemed a labor to him. But the voice went on in its weary monotony. "He was a trader, a dirty little beast of a trader, and he had a picture. It was a watercolor drawing of a bit of coast. It was a neat little dirty picture, but it was very clear in its details. One would have said that it was drawn and painted in from life. The coastline was as definite as a survey. The grove of coconut trees on its south point seemed placed with a sort of mathematical accuracy. The curve of the beach looked like a photograph. The sweep of the coral reef that bowed around the inlet was as precisely placed as though it had been taken from a chart. The marked place was between two of the coconut trees. I would have sworn that a geodetic survey had mapped it and some artist sketched it in. And yet," the tired voice drawled, "it was a dream. He said, the dirty little beast, that he saw it first in his dream, on the night he had to run for it. He had looted the firm of which he was a clerk, and he had to clear out. It was his one big job at the end of a crooked career, and he kept on seeing it in a dream, with that one spot marked between the two coconut trees. He could not draw the picture nor paint it in, but he could see it. He got so he could see it like a picture in a mirror, and finally he got a little half-cast to make the picture for him. It must have been a tedious business. It did take days on end, he said. But you must realize how well he knew the details. Of course, the picture wasn't entirely correct. He would explain it like an engineer explaining the slight errors in a blueprint. The coral reef wasn't such a perfect arc. It had a twist in it, and the top of one of those coconut trees was heavier than the other, and the stem thickened a bit more at the earth. He was very much concerned to correct the details, and he took a lot of trouble about it. You could not stop him. He'd crease the picture with his thumbnail and run after you to explain. The thing was real, that dream. There was no marked inflection in the tired voice that went on. The little beast was written by this fixed idea. There was some sort of treasure buried between those two coconut trees, and its exact location had been revealed to him in a dream. The dream kept coming back with the regularity of a cyclic monomania of the mind. He would go at everybody that he could get to listen. He would divide the treasure with anyone who would go with him to find it. He said he had an instinct about the direction. There was never a human creature so possessed with a single fixed object in life. The little beast made his life a hell with it. He would work all day like a slave, unloading grain ships, carrying the bags up out of the hold, along with the coolies, and then he would tramp about at night doing anything about the brothels, with petty thefts thrown in. He did it for years until he finally got enough cash together to buy an old hull that had an engine in it, too dangerous for even the Chinese to risk a cargo on. He must have had the devil's time to pick up a crew, even the very few that he could get along with. For all his energy, the creature could not man the craft alone. There was an engine of sorts in the scale of a hull, and there was the navigation of the thing to manage. And, too, there was the indefinite voyage that he was setting out on. He could not secure a crew from a port, but he did the thing in some fashion. After all, for a few dollars Mex, a dive leader would Shanghai a crew for him. And so he went to find his treasure, and he did find it. But it didn't turn out precisely as he expected. He was a bit off on what was buried between the two coconut trees. It turned out this way. The resident who was already on that spot of the coast wrote it in his report to the agent at Hong Kong. There was a storm, and the old craft beached on the reef and broke up. The little trader with the dream washed ashore with his lungs full of seawater, and the resident buried him at the marked place between the two coconut trees. Bennett took a drink out of the dirty tumbler. He sat back from the table, his big hands placidly linked together across his stomach. "Hell," he said, "that man was tricked into hunting for his own death. That was the long and short of it. He had a vision, a quest, and he was always longing to go on it, planning to go on it. Saved, starved, lied, stole, nothing too damned low. Finally, he has enough dollars, Mex, to get the Undertaker's stuff that they sold him for a ship. And he goes on his quest. Ghastly joke, all that trouble to get killed." He laughed, a sort of chuckle that undulated his body like a wave. He made one see what he was thinking, a pagan fate somewhere behind the world, chuckling as he was chuckling now over its little pleasantry with a fool of a mortal. Ha! It was the interjection again. It summed up his conclusion on the thing. It summed up also our conclusion. Man is altogether the sport of fortune, the ancients said. I wished to get him out of this reflection and into his own adventure. That would lead along to the thing I was after. I saw little in this incident bearing on anything that concerned me just then. Later, I remembered it. Not that it is a part of this story. It has nothing to do with this story. But you will recall it presently, just as I recalled it, not for itself, but because it has a vague resemblance to something that happened to another man. And you will see perhaps what I think I saw. The big notion under all religions. You see, this trader was a dirty little beast. Had been that from the cradle. He was so far over on the devil's side that even Bennett looked down on him. Think how far over that would be. But how about a man who wasn't on the devil's side? That was the vague relation I saw a little later on. You will understand that this was the English skipper Chillingsworth's story, the story I have just repeated. I recalled it in the intervals between Bennett's comments. I don't think he saw the bearing of it on the mystery that he was about to narrate, but perhaps he did see it in a way. At any rate, he turned sharp off into his own adventure. His voice changed. He spoke slowly, like one who wishes his words to be considered. I was coming up from the Malay Peninsula. I had a ship of the Wu Fang Company. Nothing to brag on. He made a slight gesture with the little finger of one of his hands. A great deal like the ship Chillingsworth's trader picked up. Mostly rust. There's one thing these damned Chinese know. The resistance of old iron. If the rust don't go through, they will take a chance on it. Of course, we are the men who take the chance. He included the room in a sweep of the eye. What's a white man's life to a Chinese trader? Of course, the cargo's something to him. He's concerned about that. But the crew and the skipper, if the sea gets them, why, damn the luck, and there's the accrued wages to the good. There's no executor to nose it out. And who's weeping on the dock for any white man in the service of the Wu Fang Company? There was a brief interval of silence, as though for a moment the man recalled the narrow margin that, in some dangerous experience, had barely saved him. We had shipped our cargo at sea, and were on the way north. We were loaded heavy. The old freighter was pretty deep in the water. Loaded too heavy, I thought. But that's neither here nor there. The skipper on the Dutch ship wanted me to carry a little stuff as a favor to him. And of course I did. The Freemasonry of the sea. He shot his head forward at me in a sort of gesture. I knew what he meant, a little crooked business on the side. Even the canny Chinese ship-owner couldn't stop that. He would figure what his ship could carry, and the skipper would add a few bags or a few cases on his own hook. We were creeping north. No one could make time with that junk heap. The old engines in her knew what she could stand. Any sort of speed would have shaken the bolts out of her rusty plates, but the sea was like a floor, not a ripple on it. She chugged along in that glassy sea with the smoke hanging around her rusty stack. There wasn't any wind enough to carry the smoke away, but that was luck. I don't know what we should have done in a sea. Still, there's that resistance in old iron that I mentioned. The damned chinks can smell it out. We might have weathered a gale, but I didn't want to try, not with the weight we had in the rusty hull, and that's what kept me with a weather eye out and a finger up for a breeze. I knew the primitive test. I'd seen the Chinese sailors at it, to wet the finger and hold it up. It will feel cold on the side of the wind. And I could realize Bennett's concern. He had the old freighter overloaded. A squall might put her under. It was about noon, Bennett continued, when the thing began to happen. I was keeping a pretty sharp lookout. You see, we were out of the usual trade route north, a good distance west of it, and we had the sea to ourselves. I understood what he meant. He was running some sort of contraband. German rifles reshipped at sea, perhaps, or the devil knows what. And he was keeping out of the track of ships. He wanted the sea to himself, as he said it. He would keep a sharp lookout both for wind and ships. He went on. My reflection wasn't audible. The lookout gave me a signal of something west. Strange how sharp-eyed a native can be. Give me a chink in a crow's nest to see everything under the sky. He said there was a cloud appearing. That brought me up. I was at tiffin in the officer's cabin. I had ice and some bottles, a present from the Dutch skipper. I left them. I wanted to look at that cloud. But I couldn't make out anything, not even with a glass. The sea, as far as the eye could reach, was as clear as a plate of metal. There wasn't a ripple on it. I cursed the chink in the top and sent another up. He squinted about a bit and began to squeal. There was a tiny cloud to the west. He paused, fiddling the fingers of his folded hands. An hour later I saw it. I mean, with the glass. A speck of a cloud on the extreme horizon of the sea. I got a chair up and sat down on the bridge. That cloud troubled me. It would be a landstorm on the way out. If it hung together, it would be one of those dangerous tornadoes following a track. If we were in the track... He turned the thumb of one of his hands slowly down. It was a gesture more significant than any word he could have spoken. A gesture like the decree of a fate. There were a lot of islands to the west of us, some not charted, hardly any of them known. We were taking a chance on this route north. I shouldn't have risked it, perhaps, except for the Dutch skipper's bottles. After all, I wasn't there to insure the damned cargo. The long packing cases were marked mowing scythes from Bremen. That was the Wufang Company's business. I kept watching that cloud, that speck in the sea. It was right on the water. That would be the track of a tornado. But what puzzled me was that it did not seem to move. The cloud of a tornado ought to travel. It ought to travel like hell. I thought the thing must be smoke from a steamer. But it didn't look like any smoke that I had ever seen, and it didn't act like smoke. The chinks in the top jabbered at the suggestion of smoke. It was not smoke, and presently they began to jabber about the cloud. They hung out of the top like a pair of yellow jacks in a box. And finally they gave me another decision. It was a sail. He put his two big hands out on the table in front of him, as one might put out documents to prove a statement. They seemed, as one would say it, detached from the man. Then we noticed something that we had overlooked in the excitement. There was a bit of air moving, a faint breeze coming to us from the land. The thing was a sail. I saw it after a time. But there was something about it that didn't seem right in a sail. The chinks in the top marked it, and I could see it when the land breeze freshened. It looked heavy and formless. A sail ought to have a sharp outline. It was moving directly out toward the route of the steamer. It ought to cross our track north about dark if the breeze held. It was a damned curious thing, and I kept a watch on it. But I wasn't concerned about it. There was no threat in the bit of wind. We were not in for a storm, and a thing with a sail like that could only be some native craft beating about. That conclusion was correct, in part, I mean. It was a native craft when it came within reach of the glass, a Chinese sailing sampan of the common type along the coast. There was nothing unusual about the sampan. The thing that puzzled me, puzzled the chinks in the top, was the aspect of the sails on the crude rigging. They looked heavy and ponderous. The whole rigging seemed to be covered with a loose, thick, woolly sail, not drawn taut, but hanging as though it were draped over the rigging. I was astonished. I'd never seen anything like that on any sailing craft on any water in the world. But in the slight breeze it seemed able to carry the sampan slowly out into the open sea. He didn't move his hands now. They remained before him like two bags of coin before a player on a gaming table. I had only a native crew, no other white man. A native crew isn't curious. A thing has got to get out of the order of nature to get a native crew excited. But something about the sail on that sampan worked the Chinese up. It worked me up, too. I didn't give a fiddler's curse for the sampan. It would cross the route of the ship a mile ahead, and the night would take it. Could have it and be damned for me. Still, it puzzled me as I watched it, just as the chinks watched it. I could hear the jabber in the top, and there was a yellowhead everywhere about the deck. As the outline of the thing grew clearer, one could understand why the native lookout called the thing a cloud when he first saw it. It was a cloud. At any rate, it was no proper sail. It was something heavy and thick-massed around the rigging. A heavy cloud of some sort banked around the rigging. That was the impression I got, and that is what it was. I continued to watch it through the afternoon as the breeze carried the sampan out across our route ahead. It reached the line of the steamer ahead about sunset, and then a miracle happened. He rested his weight heavily on his hands and looked at me steadily across the table. You could call it only a miracle. I had my glass on the craft at the moment, and every chink was watching. That thick woolly cloud sail suddenly detached itself from the rigging of the sampan, lifted, and moved away. And it moved against the wind back toward the land from which it had come. He shot out his jaw. Against the wind! That would be a miracle. I saw it, and every native of the crew saw it. There was an audible murmur like a sigh over the whole ship. That oriental murmur of profound astonishment that one hears, perhaps, once in a life, as though the sea had opened. Bennett did not say very much about it, but I could understand the profound curiosity on the ship as the sampan approached under this strange sail. And when the cloud lifted and went back against the wind, the whole crew must have hung breathless. A yellowhead out of every hole on that ship, to get the earliest possible solution to this mystery. They understood clouds and wind. They were creatures of the sea. Clouds and winds were important to them. They studied them. They weighed the phenomena of them. They were vital factors. And when suddenly the definite order of nature was reversed, they were appalled. A cloud did not move against the wind. A thing like that had never been observed to happen since the world began. It was beyond every detail of their experience. It was beyond every experience from the beginning. As the winds moved, so did the clouds in heaven move. But here was a wind blowing from the land, and here was a cloud that lifted and went away in the opposite direction. It was a thing that reversed life. And it impressed this old primitive race more profoundly than any modern phenomena of mystery could possibly have impressed it. If there had been a dead man come to life, they would have been astonished. If they had seen an ancient woman growing back to her youth, they would have been amazed with it. But they could have explained it as being the protean quality of a drug, the result of some feat of a witch doctor, the spell of some manner of magic, or the thing white men accomplished with their miracle business. But there was no white man here except the captain of the ship, who seemed equally amazed with the thing. And there was no witch doctor. There was no magic. This was the sea that they traveled and dwelt on, as races travel and dwell on the land. This was the sea they knew. How could the order of nature get reversed here? There could be no explanation of it, unless the explanation awaited them on the sampan that they were overhauling, the sampan that now stood bare-rigged on the sea, motionless on the track of the route north. They approached it. It must have been the tensest sort of journey, the last hour of the old freighter as it chugged toward the mystery of the sampan. It is a marvel to us, to the people of any other race, that no effort was made to increase the speed of the freighter. That would be the inscrutable oriental control of self. They must have been wild to know what was on the deck of the sampan, but it would be like this ancient race to move toward it with the usual calm. An English stoker would have coaled his ship and strained his engines. There would have been every form of hurry, but there was no change on the deck of the freighter, except that a yellow head popped out at every corner. Bennett was himself on the deck of the freighter, on the bridge of it, if this absurdity of a ship had a bridge. He kept a glass on the sampan. At the first distances it seemed empty. Nothing moved on it. It seemed to undulate gently in the sea under its bare rigging. Bennett said he thought it was an abandoned derelict of a thing drifting about. Certainly there was no crew on it. They would be moving, making some sort of signal. But there was no signal visible, and there was no motion of any living thing on the deck. He concluded finally that the sampan was abandoned. He said something like it. He called out to the men in the top, but they did not agree with him. They saw clearer with their naked eye, these Orientals bred to the visibility of the sea, than the exotic white man could, at once with his glass. They said there was something on the sampan, an indefinite something. Bennett tried to make it out, and finally he got it in the glass. It looked like a heap or bundle lying on the bare deck. That detail intrigued his curiosity. What sort of cargo could such a drifting craft carry? A mystery craft, convoyed by a sail cloud that lifted from its rigging and set aside by its axe the established laws of the universe. They could not make out what this cargo was as the freighter advanced, but the men in the top began to have some conception of it, or some theory about it. Usually silent, they began to chatter. Bennett did not inquire into their theory. Perhaps there was a bit of pride in this denial to his curiosity. Surely with a glass a white man could see as well as a half-naked yellow Asiatic in the top. At any rate he could presently see as well, and presently he did see what the cargo was. It took a clearer outline. It became visible through his glass. Bennett sat back in his chair, looking down at his motionless hands on the table, his heavy face in a sort of reflection. "When we overhauled the sampan," he said, "it was standing motionless in the sea, no sign of a sail on its bare rigging. The only thing on it was an unconscious white man lying in the sun on the rotten deck." End of chapter 1.